Today we're making my incredibly delicious pumpkin spice bread. It's plant-based, so there are no dairy or eggs, and it's got those deep pumpkin flavors that epitomize everything I love about fall. It's warming, it's comforting, it's cozy. This makes the perfect dessert for fall, especially when you add that maple tahini icing on top. But if you're feeling a little naughty, you could also have a slice for breakfast. I won't tell. We'll start by making our vegan buttermilk, and I'm using oat milk. We need about 6 tablespoons, and I'm just measuring it out. The reason I love using oat milk in vegan baked goods is because it tends to brown things a little bit better than other plant-based milks, but really any unsweetened plant milk should work. Soy milk would be really good in this recipe too. And I'm going to mix a little bit of apple cider vinegar with this. When you mix a vinegar or an acidic source like lemon juice with plant-based milk, it works similar to regular buttermilk, and when you mix it with the baking soda in the oven, it's gonna help make the baked good tender, which is really important for all vegan baked goods, but especially loaf cakes, which can be kind of dense. So we're gonna add 1 tablespoon of apple cider vinegar. Next up, we're gonna make our egg substitute, and I'm using aquafaba, which is simply the viscous, goopy, gloopy liquid from cooked chickpeas. So I've got a can of chickpeas here, and I'm gonna measure out about 6 tablespoons of this. And don't throw these chickpeas away because obviously you don't wanna waste food. And I would recommend using these for, oh shoot, I'm spilling everywhere. We're gonna have to do this a different way. For these chickpeas, I recommend using them to make my buffalo chickpea quesadillas or my chana masala. They're both really amazing. You know what I mean. All you need to do is lightly whip the aquafaba with an electric mixer for 45 to 60 seconds or until it's uniformly foamy. And as I mentioned, loaf cakes can be quite dense. So the second way I like to counteract that density is by using aquafaba as my egg substitute. It's what I love to use in cakes as well as any baked goods where I want like a light and tender texture. So it's gonna bring a really nice tender crumb to this pumpkin bread. Next, we'll mix the sugar and oil together. I'm using brown sugar because I love the molasses flavor that you're gonna get. From brown sugar, it's gonna have a lot more flavor than white sugar, and it goes really well with pumpkin. We need about 1 cup and 2 tablespoons, but I prefer to just measure everything out to the gram so it's really accurate. And it sounds a little complicated, but really all you need is a digital measuring scale like this. You can get one at a kitchen store or online for $10 to $15. And the reason you get more accurate results this way is because if you just use a measuring cup, think about I'm using a measuring cup and you're using a measuring cup at home. We have different measuring cups, we have different brands of sugar or flour or oil, so we're always gonna get slightly different results, which means we'll get slightly different baking results. So that's why I prefer to measure everything out and encourage you to do so when you're baking. Next, we'll add in 1/3 cup of sunflower oil, but any neutral oil will work just fine. We'll use the electric mixer to mix up the sugar and oil until it's nicely combined. Once that's done, add in the lightly whipped aquafaba and mix to combine. Now it's time to add in our pumpkin puree. If you are having trouble finding canned pumpkin puree or it's not commonly sold where you live, you can always grab one of these, a whole pumpkin, and make it yourself. It is very easy. Let me show you how to do it. To make pumpkin puree, you'll need a sugar pumpkin or a pie pumpkin. Don't use the really large carving pumpkins, they don't have very much flavor. Slice the pumpkin in half using a sharp knife and a rocking motion. If it's too tough to slice, pop it in the microwave for 30 to 60 seconds. Lightly salt the flesh of the pumpkin, then place the pumpkin halves on a parchment paper lined baking sheet, cut side down. Bake in the oven at 400 degrees Fahrenheit until fork tender. A pumpkin this size took about 30 minutes, but a larger one can take 40 to 45 minutes. Once the pumpkin is cool enough to handle, the skin should peel off pretty easily. Add the flesh to a food processor and puree for about 2 minutes or until you have a really smooth puree. Since homemade puree is a lot more watery than canned pumpkin, you'll need to strain it over a fine mesh sieve to thicken it up. Then measure out your pumpkin puree. For this recipe, you'll need 425 grams or about 2 tablespoons shy of 2 cups. Pumpkin puree is really dense, and as I mentioned, loaf cakes like this tend to be pretty dense too, so that's why we're counteracting that with the aquafaba and the vegan buttermilk to bring some lightness back into this cake, into this bread. Is pumpkin bread a cake, or is it a bread? I feel like it's a cake, it's just called bread. After the pumpkin, we'll add in that vegan buttermilk we made, along with 2 tablespoons of maple syrup for that rich caramel flavor that goes really well with pumpkin, and a teaspoon of vanilla extract. Mix the liquid ingredients until everything is well combined, and then we'll move on to our dry ingredients. We're gonna start with 2 cups of all-purpose flour. I'm going to measure it out. That is 240 grams. Again, oops. We also need a teaspoon of baking soda, a 1/2 teaspoon of baking powder, a scant half teaspoon of sea salt, and our pumpkin spice mixture. And the reason I call this pumpkin spice bread instead of just pumpkin bread is that there's a lot of pumpkin spice happening in here. A lot of pumpkin baked goods I've had in the past or that I see on other websites really just don't have enough spice in them to be flavorful, because a half teaspoon of cinnamon and a pinch of cloves does not make a pumpkin bread. It just makes like an orange colored cake, in my opinion. So I like making my own pumpkin spice mixture at home because it's gonna be a lot fresher and have a lot more depth of flavor than any store-bought mix. Add the pumpkin spice mix to the dry ingredients, and if you do a lot of baking, you can just make a bigger batch of this spice mix and store it in a glass jar on your counter, and then you can have pumpkin spice goods throughout pumpkin season. If you want the best pumpkin bread, and I assume you do, you gotta use freshly grated nutmeg. It's sweeter, it's more potent, and it's a lot tastier than the pre-ground stuff. You wanna whisk the dry ingredients pretty well because you want to ensure that the baking soda and baking powder are evenly incorporated so that your cake rises evenly. Now we're gonna switch to a silicone spatula and pour the dry ingredients into the wet ingredients. And this is my next tip for ensuring you get a nice, light, tender cake that's not dense or gummy. You want to mix the ingredients until they're just combined. Do not overmix them. It's okay if you have some lumps in there. Pumpkin bread is supposed to be rustic. It doesn't need to be uniformly perfect. And the reason you don't want to overmix is it causes the gluten to overdevelop, so your cake can get really tough and sometimes gummy. It can have those irregular air tunnels or holes, so you want to avoid overmixing. I've got a loaf pan here. It's lined with parchment paper, and if your loaf pan is a smaller size loaf pan, like an 8x4, this one's a 9x5, you won't need to use all of the batter. It'll be a little too much, and you'll also want to bake your cake for a little bit longer since it will be taller and more compact. We're going to bake this at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for 45 to 55 minutes. And if you have an oven thermometer, I really recommend using it because not all home ovens are calibrated. So to ensure that you have the accurate temperature, go ahead and use an oven thermometer. The best way to test whether a loaf cake like this is done is to insert a toothpick in the top sides of the cake. That's the last part to get cooked. So if you just stick your toothpick right in the middle, down the center, you might not know whether it's fully baked. Transfer the pan to a wire rack and cool for 10 minutes. Then use the parchment paper handles to remove the bread and cool on the wire rack for at least 30 minutes before slicing. While the pumpkin spice bread is cooling, we'll start on our maple tahini icing. The first thing we're gonna do is sift 1 cup of organic powdered sugar, and I like to sift it because otherwise it can be pretty clumpy. To the sifted powdered sugar, we'll also add 3 tablespoons of plant-based milk, 2 tablespoons of a good quality tahini, and 1 teaspoon of maple syrup. Whisk until you have a thick but pourable glaze. If it's too thin, you can add a little more sugar, and if it's too thick, you can add a little more milk. The hardest part about this recipe is waiting for the pumpkin bread to cool. I know it's gonna be tempting to slice into it, but this will continue baking once you take it out of the oven, so if you slice into it too quickly, you risk having an underbaked cake, so don't do that. And oh, before we slice it though, we have to add our maple tahini icing. Drizzle the maple tahini icing on top of the pumpkin bread and smooth it out with a spatula. This last part is totally optional, but if you like a little nutty crunch, you can scatter some pumpkin seeds or chopped pistachios on top. This bread is so moist and tender, and it's got those really nice warming pumpkin flavors. If you're having it for breakfast, maybe don't have the icing on top. You don't need the extra sugar for breakfast, but also I won't judge you if you do. And the tahini icing is really nice with this. It's got this unique, surprising taste that I love. And if you are looking for more delicious vegan desserts, stay tuned because I have more coming up here.